All right, so we were talking about what would be barriers to reproduction. So, what would keep animals from mating? Okay, so we can have what are called prezygotic barriers. Pre means before, and the zygote. The zygote is the cell that is the result of the union of the egg and the sperm. Okay, so prezygotic means before the zygote. So, what would keep two animals from reproducing? Okay, there are prezygotic barriers. So, for example, if they lived in totally different places, they're not getting together and breeding. Okay, that would be prezygotic. The egg and the sperm don't even unite. Okay, postzygotic. Post means after. So after the zygote, a postzygotic barrier. So maybe they do get together and then things don't work out. Like the egg and the sperm get together and things don't work out. Okay, so here it's kind of a funny picture. Here would be a prezygotic barrier. For example, individuals are physically unable to mate. The pig and the dog would not mate with one another. This is a prezygotic barrier. Or if individuals are able to mate, the male's reproductive cell is unable to fertilize the female. How about with plants? Can there be prezygotic barriers with plants? Absolutely, yes. What if plants flower at different times of the year? Okay, so the egg and the sperm can't get together, right? Because plants can reproduce sexually. So that would be a prezygotic barrier, okay? Now, what about a postzygotic barrier? Post means after the zygote. So a zygote, the egg and the sperm actually get together, but things don't actually work out. So postzygotic. So here, for example, this is an example of a mule, okay? A mule is actually a hybrid. Just like the Zorse was a hybrid, a mule is a hybrid. It says, a hybrid offspring survive, such as mules above. They are infertile and have reduced fertility. So if an animal's infertile, what does it mean for the species? Is it going to keep going? No. Bam, it stopped. It stopped right there, okay? So postzygotic. Or, so with postzygotic barriers, so the Zorse is an example, the Liger is an example, here a mule is an example. Mating produces hybrid individuals that do not survive long after fertilization, or the hybrids are sterile, okay? So these would be reasons for reproductive isolation. So over here, it says, natural species, populations of organisms that interbreed with each other or could possibly breed under natural conditions, okay? So then it's like, why wouldn't they breed with one another? Well, there could be prezygotic barriers, why they don't breed. They're breeding at different times. Or with birds, remember the birds had to do the mating dance? Well, if the birds aren't doing the same mating dance, or if they're not doing the same mating calls, they're not going to breed with one another. That would be a prezygotic barrier. Or postzygotic, right, where they do breed, but remember how we have our chromosomes or a chromosome number? So the chromosome numbers are off, bam, nothing's going to happen. Or if the species are closely related enough, maybe they do have babies, but the babies are hybrids and they're sterile or infertile. And if that's the case, then again, that species would stop there. So reproductive isolation, keeping species separate. So prezygotic, courtship rituals could be prezygotic, physical differences could be prezygotic, physical biochemical factors involving gametes. Postzygotic, after fertilization, generally prevent the production of fertile offspring, and generally, if they're going to survive, result in hybrids. Okay. How do we name species? We have in biology, we have a whole organizational system. It was created by a guy named Carolus Linnaeus, okay? And this was before we knew about DNA. So the way he organized all the different organisms, for example, think of all the different types of birds, all the different types of horses, all the different types of cats. The way he organized them is based on morphology. Morphology is their shape, their structure, okay? So a scientific name always has two parts. So no matter what living thing, even if it's bacteria, If it's plants, if it's animals, fish, insects, they always have a scientific name. And the scientific name has two parts. There's a genus and a species. So for example, think of us. Do we have a scientific name? What's our name? Yes, we do. We, as humans, were called Homo sapien. In this case, Homo is our genus name. Sapien is our species name, okay? So every organism has two parts to the scientific name. So here's a zebra, and its specific scientific name is down here. It's Equus quagga, right? So that's a zebra. But what does that mean? Where does it belong in the whole hierarchy of living things, okay? So is it an animal? Yes, okay. What kind of cells does it have, okay? So all living things fall under these three big, we call them domains, okay? So they're either going to be bacteria, those single-celled prokaryotic organisms. Archaea, they're also single-celled prokaryotes, but they live in extreme environments. Or eukarya. Eukarya are organisms where their cells, the eukaryotic cells, right? Their cells have nuclei. Okay, so here, a zebra, its cells are eukaryotic, so it is in the domain eukarya. Now, under eukarya, it could be protista, plantae, fungi, or animalia. This guy's an animal, so under the kingdom Animalia. Under Animalia, it's the phylum Chordata. Chordata means chordates. That means it has a spinal cord. Now, under the Chordata, the class is Mammalia. It's a mammal. Think about this. Animals that have a backbone. Birds have a backbone, but birds are not mammals. They're aves, right? Reptiles have a backbone. Again, they're not mammals, so they're in a different class. They would be under the phylum Chordata, but they would be birds, or they would be reptiles, or think of fish, okay? So here, with a zebra, it's a mammal. And then for the mammals, there's all kinds of mammals. Its order is Perissodactyla. Dactyl, we're talking about the toes, right? So it's a hoofed animal, right? Equidae, now we're talking about horses. Genus Equus and Equus quagga were specific to the zebra. So all living things fall under this kingdom. And again, Carolus Linnaeus created this kingdom based on the way things looked, their shape, their morphology. Now that we have DNA, we can actually look at DNA and DNA sequencing to see who is more closely related to who, what species is more closely related to what species. Okay, so it's a hierarchical system. Inclusive categories at the top. So the biggest categories are at the top, leading to more. That was the dog, by the way. The dog just snorted. Leading to more and more exclusive categories below. So way at the bottom, this is very specific. The species is for zebra. So each species on Earth is given a unique name using a hierarchical system of classification. Every species on Earth falls into one of these three domains. Now, this idea of species, the biological species concept, does not work for all things, okay? What about asexually producing organisms like bacteria? They don't have sex, so there goes the idea of breeding. What about fossils? We don't know who had sex with who, right? So that gives us a little problem. What about species that are changing? Maybe they're in the middle of speciation, right? Ring species that live in a certain area, hybrids, okay? So the biological definition of species fits, but you have to understand that other organisms or different species may not fit specifically in those areas. So for example, when we think of dinosaurs and when we classify them, we're really classifying them based on their shape, right? Because they're not around anymore. We don't know who's having sex with who. Again, bacteria, same thing. We classify them based on different things. Like, What's their metabolism like? Where do they live? Etc. So species not always easily defined. Difficulty classifying asexual species, right? So we just said that. Okay. Difficulty classifying fossils. So we said that. When one species is changed into another, it may not be possible to identify an exact point. Okay. For example, Chihuahuas and Great Danes. Are they the same species? The answer is yes. But a Chihuahua can't breed with a Great Dane. So does that mean they're different species? Okay. Those ring species, example, the animals that live in different areas around, like, say, a mountain, and maybe south of the mountain, they can breed with one another. But if we go north of the mountain, they're not breeding with one another. So then it's like, oh gosh, are they the same species or aren't they? Okay, so it talks about that. And you guys have the PowerPoint. Hybrids, they make it really difficult, right? Interbreeding closely related species, postzygotic barriers, are hybrids fertile or not? So is it a new species? Sometimes new species can arise like that, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about speciation. So morphological species concept, focus on aspects of organisms other than reproductive isolation. So that's a different way where we can classify organisms. Characterizes species based on physical features such as body size and shape. So we could do that. Can be used effectively to classify asexual species. Okay, so now for the big question. How do species arise? Like, how do we get new species of birds, new species of plants? There's something called speciation. And again, we're talking about evolution. Remember evolution, populations changing over time. So then the question is, okay, how do we get new species? All right, one species splits into two distinct. Two things have to happen. We have to have reproductive isolation, number one. So somehow there's a population and somehow there's reproductive isolation between organisms in the population. And then another thing has to happen where the gene flow in the gene pools of the two different populations change over time. Okay, so this is really important. The two things that have to happen for speciation to happen is one, reproductive isolation, which can happen, which we'll look at in just a second, and then genetic divergence. This idea that there's gene flow in the gene pool is changing, and the two gene pools with the two populations are changing differently, okay, causing two new species. So it requires more than just evolutionary change. Okay, so the two types of speciations that we're going to talk about in this class is one is called Allopatric Speciation, and the other is called Sympatric Speciation. Think of think of the same, okay? In Sympatric Speciation, the speciation is happening where the species are in the same area, okay? With allopatric speciation, there's some kind of geographic barrier that splits the species from one another, and that's allopatric. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so look at the pictures, okay? So allopatric, speciation with geographic isolation, okay? So this is a beautiful picture, right? Figure 1011. Imagine the initial population, okay? And if you look, they're all blue. Okay, and then something happens over time, right? So for example, a river, think of the Colorado River with the Grand Canyon. So something happens that isolates the population. So reproductive isolation first. And then over time, there's different ecological stress on this population and on this population, and over time they become different species, okay? So over time the populations on either side diverge enough genetically that they are no longer able to interbreed. So look at these guys, they're ground squirrels. They look very, very similar, okay? They are a result of allopatric speciation. But they are different species. And so what that means is over time, if you took a green guy and a blue guy and put them together, they won't have sex, they won't have babies, they're different species, okay? So allopatric speciation. We're gonna stop here and continue.